The Utah Jazz find themselves at a point in the season where they are now in a soft rebuild after they ended up going into last season, continuing out at the end of the season, going ahead and trading away a lot of players at the deadline and deciding to make a couple moves that would end up pushing things later on down the line. What ended up happening was at the end of that season, we saw them end up resting a lot of their star players, Larry Markkinen included. And while it wasn't exactly the most enjoyed part of the season for those gentlemen, it was something that made sense for them at the time because they didn't have the pieces necessary to make a championship run. The one thing that Justin Zanuck and Utah Jazz CEO Danny Ainge have made abundantly clear is that they're planning on building a championship contender, and they will stop at nothing to do so. With that being the final point, you find a lot of situations where they're trying to find different pieces that can fit the machines, fit the timeline, see if the rookies end up panning out, if they don't. And now we find ourselves at the end of this season with Taylor Hendricks and Keontae George playing a large sum of minutes, trying to figure out exactly what type of pieces they are. Bryce Sensabaugh seems to be concluded to be a longer term project, so he's not really seeing very many minutes so far, but I think that he will see an uptick as the season progresses, as there's only roughly 26 games left for the Utah Jazz season. Now, because they're not exactly going to go ahead and rest all their key pieces as starters, whether it be your Colin Sextons or your Larry Markkanens, you get the sense that they're just trying to get these guys acclimated to playing alongside their stars. So it isn't a complete tank, but it is still a soft version of one. I am not always the biggest fan of tanking, but I do understand the necessity of it if you're a small market team and you think that you can get genuinely strong draft picks out of doing so. In this situation, it seems like they're trying to go ahead and convey this pick because later on down the road, they're looking at picking up a sneaky big player. And by big, I do indeed mean big. Now, mind you, Larry Markkinen is considered to be a star player for this team, and while he may not be the elite piece that they need for a championship run by himself, they still want to find somebody to pair alongside him. Now, there have been rumblings that they feel that Colin Sexton still might not be that ideal guy to have alongside him, and they need more than that, and so much so that they'd be willing to trade away Colin Sexton despite his efficient scoring this season. And the main issue is his length, because it leaves him in a situation where he will ultimately always be a slight liability on the defensive side of the ball, despite his high energy and high impact when it comes to team morale, the culture, being a leader for the team, as well as scoring very efficiently and seeing his uptick in playmaking go so high in ways that a lot of people didn't actually see coming. James Hansen is a writer for SLC Dunk, and he actually also happens to be known on YouTube as Hoops Nerd, and he specializes in Utah Jazz media as well. And he actually had a very interesting article that he put together on the SLC Dunk site. The title was "Breaking Down the Last 2 Seasons of Utah Jazz Shows They're on a Path That Leads to Cooper Flagg." Anybody that knows me knows I'm not the biggest on Cooper Flagg, though he does have insane immeasurables and a lot of things that you just can't teach. You can't teach size, you can't teach height, you can't teach length. You can teach skill, but you can't necessarily teach instinct and desire. Those things are innate within a player and they make those decisions. I do believe that Cooper Flagg could potentially be an interesting piece to pair alongside Larry Markkinen, and also considering the fact that they wouldn't necessarily be a Twin Towers lineup, seeing as Walker Kessler would still be serviceable and he just needs to get himself added on a little bit more of a jumper. Right now, him shooting 50% from the free throw line isn't going to cut it. Adding on a mid-range jumper, even if he doesn't get to a great 3-ball, we don't need him to be Karl-Anthony Towns, even though that would certainly help. Him being able to just modestly hit elbow pull-ups allows other things to be worked around in the offense. But I found this article to be very interesting because of the way that he alludes to the potential of them going after Cooper Flagg. Now, we do know they want a piece that is going to be so significant that it can push them over the edge once they're fully developed. But we also understand that Larry Markkinen, if they do decide to keep him and don't eventually trade him, is going to be on a very tight leash. Now, at the age of 27 years old, he's about to enter his prime if you do not feel like he's already in it. And there's a very finite number of years that they have to work with in order to build a contender. In my mind, I think we have about 3 years before we decide what this team's going to be, and for certain whether Larry Markkinen stays or whether they go ahead and ship him out. Regardless, I do think they will end up re-signing him over this offseason and going ahead and extending that contract out to give him a little bit of extra money next year, going from $18 million up to $43 million with that added $25 million bonus slapped on there. But I think that there's very few reasons for Lowry to go ahead and just leave this team despite the soft rebuild era that they're in at the moment. Now, the key thing that really gives me a little bit more merit towards James' idea happens to be the fact that The Nets actually decided earlier on this week that they were going to go ahead at the end of the season and just center this team around Mikal Bridges, who was a player that I wanted us to target at the trade deadline and eventually see paired alongside Larry Markkinen and Colin Sexton. Because this player is an extremely defensively talented player, but also an extremely offensively talented player and a skilled scorer with high efficiency, basically negating the negatives that Colin Sexton brings on defense, even when he is a potentially poor matchup against certain lineups, as well as providing a consistent and direct scoring threat alongside Colin Sexton and Larry Markkinen, instead of having to rely on Jordan Clarkson to have his inconsistencies be consistent at some point going forward. But I digress. Now, the thing that I appreciated most about this article, and again, I will end up linking it down in the comment section below so that you guys can read it yourselves thoroughly if you do so desire to, but he broke it down into segments, leading them by each important move that was made, whether it be trades or hirings. And it all starts on June 28th in 2022 when the Utah Jazz hired Will Hardy. Now, for those that understand, Will Hardy has been a very instrumental piece in what the Utah Jazz have been capable of doing and what they plan on doing in the future. He's been the guy that's kind of turned trash and used goods to treasure, essentially. And you saw that culminate in the fact that a lot of us didn't want to get rid of Fontecchio. Now, Fontecchio, obviously, his first season wasn't really great, and he did deal with a lot of injuries, which also attributed to it. But at the end of the day, the head coach is responsible for putting the best guys out on the court in accordance with whatever the management team decides they want them to do and whatever ownership decides is best for the team, best for the fans, and best for the business. And credit to Will Hardy, he's really been able to do that consistently. He's found out how pieces work and how different cogs in the machine can find their ways around things, and then puts them in lineups for the most part that allow them to succeed. Now, there have been different growth periods, and again, we are in one once again. But lately, we've seen growth from Keontae George. We've seen a little bit from Taylor Hendricks, but there's still much more to be seen going forward. No matter how you feel about it, all people can understand that Will Hardy is a young, developing coach that has a lot of high upside and very low risk. He followed that up saying on July 6, 2022, Rudy Gobert was traded to the Wolves. Now, if you guys remembered, we got Malik Beasley, Patrick Beverley, Leandro Balmaro, Jared Vanderbilt, Walker Kessler, a 2023 first-round pick from Minnesota, a 2025 first-round pick from Minnesota, a pick swap in 2026 for first-round picks, and a 2027 first-round pick from Minnesota, along with a top 5 protected 2029 first-round pick from Minnesota. That's a lot, right? Continuing on down the list, we ended up dealing away Patrick Beverley next. We sent Patrick Beverley to the Lakers and in return got THT and Stanley Johnson, who's no longer with us. Now, obviously, THT still gets some rotational minutes, but a lot of people thought he was going to get traded away at the trade deadline. However, the biggest theme seemed to be there just wasn't enough interest around him to garner any meaningful trade. And so, bar anything insane, I don't think that they'll end up re-signing him at the end of the season, and this will be his last year with the Utah Jazz, allowing him to go free and find a team that will be willing to pay for his services, and perhaps he'll be able to revitalize his career and create more for himself in a different situation. On September 3rd, 2022, Donovan Mitchell was dealt to the Cleveland Cavaliers. One of my favorite players of all time was brought back in this trade, as well as a couple other pieces. It was Ochai Agbaji, Larry Markkinen, Colin Sexton, a 2025 first-round pick from Cleveland, a 2026 pick swap for the first-rounders, a 2027 first-round pick from Cleveland, and a pick swap in 2028 in round 1, and a 2029 first-round pick from Cleveland. Pretty big hauls for both Donovan Mitchell and Rudy Gobert. So much so that we ended up getting 2 dominant stars back and a defensive centerpiece that could anchor the defense for years to come once he really grows into his own, becomes more aggressive, and kind of develops a little bit more of a mean streak in Walker Kessler. Bogdanovich actually ended up being traded to the Detroit Pistons next on September 22nd, 2022. We ended up getting back Saben Lee, Kelly Olynyk, cash, and a TPE. Now, all in all, not a crazy trade. We did end up enjoying some quality time with Kelly Olynyk, and I think he really impacted the culture and the bigs in this city, more so Walker Kessler than anybody, and I think he definitely learned a lot from his tutelage. Even though we really haven't seen a jumper develop out of him or a really strong passing sense, I would like to see some of that get a little bit flashy going on down the road. But those things do take time, and so there's no need to go ahead and force it. On February 9th, 2023, Malik Beasley, Jared Vanderbilt, Nickeil Alexander-Walker, and Mike Conley were traded to the Lakers and Timberwolves for a 2027 first-round pick. Now, the Lakers received in this deal Malik Beasley, D'Angelo Russell, Jared Vanderbilt, and multiple TPEs. The Wolves received Nickeil Alexander-Walker, Mike Conley, a least favorable 2024 second-round pick, and a 2025 second-round pick from Utah, alongside a 2026 second-round pick from Utah and a TPE. The Jazz received a conditional 2027 first-round pick from the Lakers and multiple TPEs. Now, this was one of the biggest trades that saw us give away a key piece that saw a streak of us being a really good team turn into us being a really mediocre team at best. In this situation, it was Mike Conley. This year coming around, we saw guys like Kelly Olynyk and Fontecchio. Agbaji was like a little bit of a lesser piece. We just didn't think he was going to pan out as much as we originally hoped he would, and he was in a sophomore season slump. I don't know if he will recover. I would like to see him do well in the future, but it doesn't seem like things were trending well or better for him in the long term with the Utah Jazz and their plan. However, we saw Kelly Olynyk be a big guy for them offensively in that second unit, distributing the ball. And then we saw Fontecchio step into that starting small forward spot and really be the best wing that we had. Even though those trades mirror each other, there's a little bit more to go. On February 22nd, 2023, the Utah Jazz signed Kris Dunn to his first 10-day contract. Following that, they re-signed him again for another 10 days and then gave him a contract through the rest of the season and through this year, which ended up getting guaranteed earlier on this season, which was lovely because Kris Dunn is a very big culture guy. He plays really solid defense. He's also known for having a really knack for having a strong passing sense, takes efficient shots, doesn't take too many shots, and knows how to orchestrate the offense and communicate on defense, which is something that I hope Keyonte George ends up developing and really taking note of. He's also a very low cost kind of guy, and it just makes sense that they end up keeping him around for the long term and seeing what they can get out of that situation. On June 22nd, 2023, the Utah Jazz drafted Taylor Hendricks, Keyonte George, and Bryce Sensabaugh, the three rookie lineup. Keyonte George and Taylor Hendricks have seen some sporadic minutes together across the season. Taylor Hendricks has a less than polished offensive game, a decently polished defensive game that still needs a little bit of work, particularly in the zones and type of defensive formations that Will Hardy likes to run and mix things up. But I think that he has the frame, size, and intelligence to really get that job done. His numbers in the G League don't necessarily jump off the page, and while Bryce Sensabaugh's do from a scoring perspective, defensively he leaves much to be desired, and he's still a little bit turnover prone. Keyonte George, obviously out of the three, is the most polished, therefore at the 16th pick, being the middle guy in between all of them, he has seen the most minutes and he has seen the most opportunity. Also take into account the fact that he played in the preseason and in the summer league and balled out. It makes sense. Keyonte is that original guy that should warrant the most amount of respect, at the very least for this year. Taylor Hendricks being the 9th pick, some people are calling him a bust. That doesn't make sense to me. The guy didn't get to play in the beginning because of minor injuries, and while he hasn't jumped off the page in the G League, he also hasn't been a bad player in the G League. So give him a little bit more time, allow him to cook, and I think Will Hardy will find a way to make him the player that he needs to be. Again, remember, Walker Kessler wasn't that solid in the beginning of his season last year, and then he came on late and really started lighting things up. Bryce Sensabaugh is a little bit more of a wild card player. He kind of gives me Jordan Clarkson vibes because of his turnover proneness and his lack of defensive intensity, but he is a more consistent scorer at the very least in the G League, so I don't know how well that will exactly translate to the NBA, but his efficiency from college to the NBA G League has seemed to be pretty decent. Overall, I prefer his shot selection now than I did before. He's become a little bit more of a passer willingly, and while it comes and goes, it's definitely an improvement, but there's much more to go for him. The Utah Jazz on July 7th traded for John Collins. Now, the interesting thing about this was they actually sent away Rudy Gay in a conditional 2026 second-round pick from Memphis alongside a TPE and received John Collins. The original plan, though, was for them to go ahead and hunt down Kristaps Porzingis, but he ended up actually the Boston Celtics. Go figure, he's balling out there, he's playing great defense, he's scoring the ball at will, and things just look really good. They're a title contending team. If the Jazz were to get Kristaps Porzingis, though, that would be kind of a win-now move. I don't know about you guys, but to me, picking up Kristaps Porzingis in the offseason doesn't really seem like we're kind of tanking move. It comes down to me as we're trying to get something going. We're trying to get some motion about us. And while it didn't work, it led to them picking up John Collins, who didn't necessarily pan out the way they originally hoped to, but he has provided them to be a stretch five kind of player whose jumper has been a little bit off as of late. But in the beginning of the season, it made sense for him, even though his defense was poor. And once he showed up his defense just a little bit more and hit more consistent threes, it allowed Will Hardy to mix and match some lineups, put Walker Kessler on the bench with that second unit that was basically defensively challenged, and balance things out for both parts of the roster. On February 8th, 2024, that was the trade deadline. We saw Ochai, we saw Kelly Olynyk, we saw Fontecchio leave. Ochai and Kelly Olynyk, along with the TP, went for Lewis, Otto Porter Jr., a least favorable 2024 first round pick and a TPE to us. And then the Pistons received Fontecchio. We also saw in that trade us get Kevin Knox, who ended up getting bought out shortly after. The draft rights to Gabriel Prigida, who's still overseas in the EuroLeague and does have a decent bit of promise. And then a most favorable 2024 second round pick, cash, and a TPE. Now, Hoops Nerd sums this up in totality, saying that Danny Ainge will do whatever he can to build this team into a contender. He's done a massive rebuild stage for 1 year tanking, and then he did a soft one this year where it doesn't seem like he's planning on tanking and getting the greatest top 10 pick you can get, but it looks like they still do plan on going ahead and shipping out the pick this year in favor of potentially making a move to try and grab Cooper Flagg in the upcoming years. When you really think about it, most championship caliber teams and most teams that end up making a play at being a true contender always tend to have a top 5 to 10 player at least on their roster, if not multiple. Because of that and the fact that we don't think Lauri Markkanen is a top 10 player, it puts us in a situation where we don't have enough talent around him to go ahead and get the job done. So we're going to have to draft it because, let's face it, no guys willingly end up picking the Jazz for the most part in free agency. There haven't been that many guys that chose to do that. In the article and in the eyes of Hoops Nerd, he thinks that Cooper Flagg could potentially be that guy that they end up making a play on. I, for one, would welcome it, though I do have my gripes with Cooper Flagg. I think that overall he has the skill, he has the size, and he has the coachability aspect that will allow him to potentially be a really great player in today's league. I don't think he has as drastically high a ceiling as Wembanyama, because I think Wembanyama has a knack for playing defense. I think that Cooper Flagg lacks a little bit over there, even though he can get blocks. I think his motor is kind of coming and going. And for me personally, I don't necessarily love that about his game. I digress because, again, I do think that at his peak or borderline near it, he would be close enough to a top 10 player, if not close enough alongside Lauri Markkanen as two borderline top 15, top 20-ish players, as long as the rest of the roster is filled out well to go ahead and make a play at things that really matter for us. I don't know if we actually end up going that far, but it's definitely a potential thing that could occur. All in all, I just wanted to take this time because this article is actually very well put for James Hansen. Shout out to Hoops Nerd for always doing the thing. Even though we don't always agree on what the Jazz should do, what the Jazz have done, and the perspectives on things, I do always enjoy having similar and altering opinions to go ahead and review and just have a simple dialogue with you guys about. I do think that Cooper Flagg ultimately could be an MVP caliber player in his own right. Would I love if we trade away Colin Sexton? No. Is it possible that we trade away our bench all-star in Jordan Clarkson? Possibly. But in a world where Hoop Nerd's reality comes true, you see Colin Sexton and Jordan Clarkson get shipped out, probably along with some draft picks to either potentially move us up in the draft or put us in a situation to where we can go ahead and nab Cooper Flagg outright. I don't know how exactly that ends up playing out and what team would end up making the play to allow us to do that. But I think we do have a very reasonable sum of assets that would allow us to potentially make somebody's GM and make somebody's ownership, at the very least, contemplate it and maybe just swing things our way. But you guys let me know what you think in the comments below. As always, I'm always interested. Would you even like Cooper Flagg on this team alongside Lauri Markkanen? Do you think it would be a Twin Towers lineup, the likes of AD and DeMarcus Cousins, but maybe on steroids because they can both shoot? Or do you think that it's a little bit foolish to go ahead and even hope for something of that magnitude, and instead we should be more realistic and try and find a piece, even though Mikal Bridges is off the table, maybe see a player like DeJounte Murray and try and pry him away from the Atlanta Hawks, or maybe another wing player potentially from another team that might be on the outs. As always, it's your boy Wraith Hoops. Thanks for tuning in this video. Make sure to like the video, subscribe, comment, and turn on post notifications. Become a member to support the content. And as always, good morning, good evening, good night, no matter where you're on the globe watching. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll catch you guys in the next one. Peace.